right, is everyone back from their groups? On the advice of my personal statistician, we will have a different method of choosing which group goes first. And it's a random number, which I will just think of in my head. Since he hasn't brought his randomization list, bit of an oversight, Nick. All right, group 5.
Good morning. This is Jihad Al-Ghamdi from Saudi Food Drug Authority. So first of all, I want to declare that we lost our facilitator, so we didn't have a facilitator. So we facilitated the discussions. Mainly, we have identified mainly 3 scenarios where we find that it is possible, although we agreed that it's very difficult at this stage, at this time, that to waive the requirement for phase 3 clinical trials and totally depend on real-world evidence. However, we said that in case of emergency situations, we know now that such the case of with the COVID emergency use authorization and the rolling review. This is one case that can be depending on the pandemic and emergency of the case. It could be relied on real-world evidence. Second scenario, if there is a solid evidence about the platform, a vaccine platform with a longer history, in such a case like the influenza. And then we also said that yes, for the case of extension of the already approved or registered vaccine, in the case of extension of the indication or to add another population to the approved indication. These the mainly 3 scenarios that we have discussed during our discussion.
So when you say vaccine platform, you mean for a different disease?
It could be if the platform, for example, in case of the mRNA, for example, if we have a huge evidence about the vaccine platform, or it's the same if we're adding like a new variant, that's also
variants
yes.
of the same pathogen.
Yeah.
Extrapolation for different pathogens of the same platform. What does CEPI think about that?
What?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Because I think it's an interesting idea. Can we?
Well, take the example of influenza and COVID. So not to speak about strain change in the COVID field or a new seasonal influenza vaccine where we actually don't generate phase 3 data for decades now. But both have within that same pathogen other viruses that you would not be so sure if you can leverage all the evidence that you have. You know, a new influenza virus, avian influenza virus, or a SARS-3 virus, or a MERS, or even a non-Sabico or beta coronavirus, for example. So the within platform evidence, I think, is something that we need to look into beyond just thinking of a new pathogen, really, from another virus family. And this is something that CEPI looks into. We look into broadly protective beta coronavirus vaccines or broadly protective Sabico virus vaccines. And I think still today, looking at FDA maybe, some of the licensure discussions across platforms, even for variant-adapted vaccines, is still somewhat difficult. Thank you.
It's an interesting point you brought up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Group 2.
Is it okay to just use this microphone?
Yeah, you go there for Rebecca.
It's okay. So we had a very nice discussion, and what I've captured is again we have a very good representation of this in our group. I think we think that actually there will be a large need for public education and engagement. We also see that we'll need to have a greater reliance on potentially CHIM studies and understanding of correlates of protection. picking up from the discussion yesterday as well, really there would be a requirement to have improved harmonization and standardization of guidance on endpoints and approaches and designs of trials so that we could really ensure that we would be able to have comparable studies. We believe that there should be potentially a paradigm shift. I don't know if exactly that's the right word to use, but really moving into a different relationship between the developers themselves and as well as with public institutions. So maybe a greater reliance on execution of these types of studies in public and private partnerships, which we think will demand an increased amount of transparency and collaboration across developers. I know that we have seen here demonstrated the efforts have become and a lot of collaboration in Cove Drive, a lot of collaboration between developers, but we would really like to see even a higher level of transparency that may transcend actually some of the interests of the individual developers themselves. We also felt that it was very important to recognize that, one size doesn't fit all. A lot of these conditions and scenarios will rely upon the outbreak itself and its public health significance and impact. That's what we came up with.
Yeah, that was very helpful because you sort of looked at the context, population context and risk communication and perception that would have to accompany such an approach. Big issue, because even, with the RCTs that COVID vaccines underwent, there was still the resistance in the, being experimented on and so forth. I don't think it's insurmountable, but it's a big challenge. Group 3, what about Group 3 next?
Okay, so for Group 3, I think we had quite a bit of an overlap with Group 2. Instead of looking at scenarios, we identified conditions that we think need to be met. We had in all 6 basic conditions, we think. So the first one is quite evident. It's the big public health concern. It needs to be urgent. There needs to be a time factor, an unmet need, and no viable alternative. The second point is quite evident as well. It's to have really solid phase 2 data. Not only safety data, which would need a minimum of picking up 1 over 1,000, an incidence of 1 over 1,000, so a minimum of 6,000 people within the phase 3 trial and 3,000 exposed. You need, of course, the immunogenicity data, so good surrogates, which have to be identified. These are, of course, pathogen-specific. And, of course, you need the animal or primate model that was defined as well by Group 2. I think what's very essential was another point was the stopping rules and the conditions once you're launching these trials. Well, not the trials, the real-world vaccine effectiveness data. The stopping rules have to be both with regards to safety and protection. We also identified the importance of risk communication when we're doing this, the importance of the risk-benefit evaluation before starting, because of course there's not one size fits all, so we really picked that up too. And I think the last thing is to never exclude the possibility of randomization, even if it's in a public health program. And there are different methodologies of doing this. It's been proven with intervention and screening methods, different wedge designs and pragmatic trials. That's what we identified. Thank you.
Very much. To clarify that the correlative protection or surrogate protection, that there would be the kind of evidence that manufacturers would need before proceeding to phase 3. Not an established correlative protection, because then you can obviate the need to do a phase 3. But this is, evidence that it's producing something in the immune system that looks to be pathogen specific, and we understand in the general context is associated generally with protection, but it's not an established correlate. Group 4.
I think Group 3 did a pretty good job there on many of the things. I mean, we were talking about the fact that the benefit risk needs to be understood, to make the decision. So, and that really it could help to have a bit of a finer stratification of the emergency declarations to, you know, extreme emergency, which would be maybe COVID with a much higher fatality rate in younger age groups, for example, where we're pretty sure things would have probably gone a different way had that been the case anyway. But to actually have those scenarios thought about beforehand, and then the conditions we've all been talking about applying to those, to sort of set up those, and, you know, as examples, they can't obviously ever cover everything, would be helpful. So it was kind of having that, you know, this emergency and almost that extra level of severity, whereby maybe under the COVID situation things would have gone differently. And we were trying to think through practically what would have been. I mean, other than what's already been discussed, getting into these randomized pragmatic trials, or even, you know, you still start a randomized RTC at the beginning, as early as you can, whilst, you know, everything is still being rolled out. But so you will still have those available until the point at which you obviously have to then stop your trial and vaccinate the control arm. But that might still generate very good evidence data, you know, within that time, as well as the potential pragmatic rollout, particularly when vaccine supply isn't, you know, you can't vaccinate everyone. So it's thinking about that, which then, you know, then the real world evidence where it's fully observational will follow. But I mean, personally, I was saying that I would have been pretty nervous under the current the COVID scenario if there hadn't been those trials and the first real world evidence was coming from our test negative case control. I remember the first few weeks after the first dose was given, the actual incidence was higher in the I don't know if you remember that, because the vaccine was being given in hospitals and people we think might have been catching it while they were going to get vaccinated, and that would have been pretty scary. So I think, you know, we having the randomised pragmatic or something else that would still be there would be, I think, important. I may be getting onto the second question now, but yeah, and I think we're getting to LMICs later as well in the second question about how that could happen in an LMIC, something we maybe need to think about. Did I miss anything, anyone? Had a good group. I think three.
Did your group consider, in fact we did consider, whether you could generate kind of real world evidence on correlates of protection? You remember how we did for MEN-C? Yes, as the program was being rolled out, there was actually waning efficacy over time, and we plotted the decline in serum bactericidal antibodies.
Yes, it's the sort of
validating.
It's your sort of indirect way of looking at correlates, which I think is also helpful and can potentially be done by looking at how your antibody levels and effectiveness differs across time or population,
age group.
Yeah.
So some commitment
to do that,
do that, to maximise the information coming from the real world evidence to support licensure.
The last thing was, we were saying right at the end, it was like it would be helpful to get agreement across agencies, WHO, around how this all would work. So to get the stakeholders on board. Yeah.
I think we're making some real progress here.
Yeah. Quick comment. We did that also for the long-acting monoclonal antibodies for Evusheld. That's what we did. Like after we had the authorization, we had the real-world effectiveness study this time in the Veteran Affairs, and what we were able to show is that the effectiveness data exactly mimics the neutralization data. So there is precedent.
Yeah. So what other groups? Group 1. Have we got an online group today? Julia, are you doing an online group? But let's do group 1. You were group. Is that the online one? Oh, right. That's collapsed, does it? All right, group 1.
Okay. So we're group 1. It can be brief because I think most of the things really have been covered already. I think we had quite a bit discussion, as was just mentioned, also about, do you really want to do only real world evidence, and what's the definition? If you have pragmatic trials, etc., can you look at some kind of intervention and having more of a not such a strong divide between either phase 3 highly regulated or just observational, take whatever you have, but think of some sort of randomization, especially in the early phases. Also, key point on communication, indeed, like the risk benefits need to be clear so that people want to be vaccinated, and that you keep the confidence also for later on. So that then goes with all kind of criteria on the sort of disease, and mostly an outbreak and time component, etc. Yeah, I think. Oh yeah, I think one of the. I think a lot of us are then maybe also thinking about outbreaks in low and middle income countries, if it's about the emergency situations. But then it's important to be prepared to have spoken to regulators before, to have scenarios ready, and to make sure that indeed definitions and outcome ascertainment is possible. Because if you want to rely on real world evidence, then you need to be sure that you're going to be able to collect the appropriate quality of evidence with all potential confounders, etc. I don't know whether. I mean, there's a lot more in the paper, but there's so much been said already.
I think the idea of having some kind of hybrid, try and preserve some element of randomization, if it can be done ethically and practically. This is something that Richard Pito is always promoting, because even then, if you have, I mean, it wouldn't be blinded. So there's always the issue of, biased ascertainment of outcomes, but the outcomes will be ascertained through the normal surveillance or healthcare interactions. So which groups haven't we had? Julia's? Are you? Oh, Phil.
We're a hybrid of 3 groups now.
It's what?
Not to trip over these lines
No.
again. Yeah, I mean, similar themes to what other people are saying, use of hybrid pragmatic trials. And again, a lot of work is ongoing around this. Some of the technical aspects of that are not specific to vaccines. I think what's specific to vaccines, and particularly emergency vaccines, is the appetite to take risk. You're giving it to healthy people, mass immunization. Yeah. But technically, some of these challenges are definitely not just specific to vaccines. I think one of the other things we talked about was, we're already doing some of this. We've talked about licensing vaccines based on correlates, and correlates that are not necessarily validated. So we have kind of done this, We authorise all sorts of vaccines based just on surrogates. So it's not like we haven't done this before. I think kind of one of the things we touched upon is, from a safety point of view, pretty much all or most of the major safety issues that impact benefit risk would never be detected in a phase 3 trial anyway. They're so rare. So it's kind of getting that balance between, if you've already got confidence in a, maybe a vaccine construct or a mock-up, we do mock-ups with pandemic flu vaccines. If you have confidence in that already from an immunological and a safety point of view, how big does a trial need to be? Because you're not going to pick up the rare risks. You always have to detect them in the real world anyway. So it's getting that balance really. Did you really need a phase 3? Can you just have a smaller study and then have a plan to collect the data in the real world, which, would be a risk management plan normally. But then that comes on to the point is, the kind of data needed are only really collected by health authorities or academics. Industry generally don't have access to the data. So it's then a case of whose responsibility is it? Because the regulators will put that responsibility on industry, of course they do. But then what's the point in health authorities handing the data over to industry, who then hand it back to the regulator? There's just no point in that process. So there needs to be a framework there for access, or the data gets shared by the health authority. So it's kind of, who's responsible for that, And then another point was, nobody wants to do real world data within the context of GCP because it will never get done. But having a framework that gives regulators confidence in the quality, an ICH-like framework for delivering that kind of data, so you have some sort of standardization, not to the level of GCP, but again, it's kind of already done now with the NCEP seal of approval, that kind of process that can give regulators confidence that data is collected and of a certain quality. But yeah, I mean, the fundamental thing with vaccines, it's the appetite to take risk and communicating that to the public, communicating those decisions. We have to tackle that as well. Did I miss anything from my group? No, that was the main themes. Thank you.
Yeah, well, what sort of overarching body do you consider kind of giving the authority to this? Is there a WHO committee, or international regulatory, body or something?
There isn't, but I guess that's it. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe that's the thing that we do need to strive for, particularly in an emergency situation. And it goes back to that whole point. During the last pandemic, 25 different regulators asking different slight variations on the same question. Can that be harmonised through one supranational organisation? I don't know. In an ideal
That's
way.
your
That's my
roadmap for become, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll tackle that one.
Which groups haven't I got? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 7? We got group 7? Oh, cat.
I don't think we have a lot to add, except that maybe there are examples, like Mpox is maybe also an example where that would fit this kind of thinking. And we also had like an important scenario where we could use this is when the disease is very rare, so not only in pandemic situations, but also for rare diseases, or when there's such a high case fatality rate that it's not even ethical to not give the product to patients. And then we also discussed a little bit about the randomized clinical trials and real-world evidence, and then it's got a little bit blurry. So I think we all agree, more or less, or have similar.
You say the
ideas.
monkeypox example, there's a decision to use the vaccine for smallpox, which hadn't had proven efficacy against smallpox, for monkeypox. Was that a regulatory decision, or who knows?
Who knows?
I thought it was a public health decision. Was it a regulatory one? Do you want to use the mic?
Yeah, it was regulatory. We decided to use the smallpox vaccine and basically under the assumption that it would be protective. So it was not public health implemented, but regulatory.
Did you give it an emergency use authorization then?
I don't remember exactly, so I don't want to be quoted on that, but yes, we did authorize it. I think it was a licensure, but I think it was a licensure. Yeah.
Yeah, it was already
because
licensed
it
for a
was
different
already
indication.
licensed, but it was a new indication for an existing licensed vaccine. That's what it was. Thanks for reminding me.
But I think it helps if there are precedents that are not too different. It gives a little bit of confidence. You're not breaking entirely new ground.
And coming back to that, because I will forget, Alzheimer and all that, maybe a number of people here at the conference have provided very interesting examples of occasions in which we have used different pathways. There is the MENC example. There is an elderly person, Steve Black is here somewhere. Okay, so elderly, he's absent. So he gave the example of the HIV vaccines. We also discussed pneumococcal vaccines and a number of monkeypox now, and of course COVID. So what I was thinking is maybe we could, one of the objectives of this conference could be to summarize those experiences in a report, publication, or whatever, because I certainly have forgotten many of these examples and don't have the references for each one of them. And if we want to, when you talk to regulators, you're like talking to the Supreme Court, you need to give us precedent. And if we create a body of precedents, that might help for the future and get into the option of pragmatic trials being used a little more extensively, for instance. And if there is an emergency, real world evidence directly, etc. But, what I was trying to do is to suggest that we can find a way to keep this experience from the past alive by a report or a publication. I don't know if the group is interested, but I certainly would be interested in learning more from the details of each one of these experiences, some of which I didn't know about, others I had forgotten, like monkeypox, don't, anyway.
I think Nick in the discussion after the meeting yesterday, threw out an interesting question. If the COVID vaccines, with all their phase 2 data showing, TH1, TH2 responses, neutralizing, binding antibody, had proceeded at that point without a phase 3, and the real-world evidence was then accumulated, would it have, been convincing? Well, why would it? Well, maybe we discuss that later. Because I thought the consensus in the group was, yeah, it would have been. We've learned much more about how these vaccines perform from the real-world evidence than from the initial clinical trial. Yeah, we need to get on. We need to get on.
May I ask?
We'll have a discussion later. Sorry, we've got group.
Sorry, with respect of the program, because we still have quite a heavy
got
agenda.
All groups responding?
I propose that we
Is
continue.
there any group that hasn't reported back?
Yes.
There is.
Is there any group? Is there not a group 8? No? Okay, so then we are complete. Sorry to interrupt. So we have, after the coffee breakout 4, how to overcome main barriers, etc. So there we have probably opportunity under your presidency, under your chair, to continue this very interesting discussion. So before the coffee break, may I ask everybody to come here, is that right, Maddie, for a group photo?